Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a topic that's especially relevant right now with that fallback coming up, daylight saving time. When we get that extra hour of sleep, it always gets me thinking, why are we even still messing with our clocks like this?
Well, it's a question a lot of people have, for sure. And to really get into it, we got to clear a big misconception right off the bat. Daylight saving time, it wasn't actually made for farmers.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, farmers were actually totally against it back in the day.
Yeah, that's right. The push for DST really came about during World War I. It was all about trying to conserve energy.
Exactly.
The idea was, shift the clock forward so people wouldn't need as much artificial light in the evenings, saving those resources, right? Especially coal during wartime.
Makes sense back then, for sure.
Yeah.
But obviously, things have changed quite a bit since World War I, so it's worth asking ourselves, does DST even really save energy in today's world?
Good point. Yeah.
It's not really a simple yes or no answer either.
Okay, so let's break it down. We've all heard that energy saving argument, right? But what's the reality?
Well, it might have actually been effective, with those old incandescent light bulbs. But the way we use energy these days is totally different.
Right.
We've got air conditioners running, electronics are on all the time, and we have way more efficient lighting options now. All those things have really changed how much, if any, energy DST actually saves.
So maybe not seeing those big benefits we used to?
Maybe not. There are even some studies, that suggest DST might actually increase energy use in some places.
Really?
Think about it. If people are using more air conditioning to stay cool with those longer daylight hours, or even more heat in the dark mornings during winter, well, that could just cancel out any savings from using less lights, right?
Oh, never thought of it that way. Always just assumed it was a net positive, for energy.
Yeah.
So it seems like DST is way more complicated than we tend to think. And speaking of different perspectives, not everyone around the world even observes DST, right?
Yeah.
Is that because some places just figured out it's not worth the hassle?
Could be. It's definitely interesting to look at it from that global perspective. Only about 40% of the world actually does daylight saving time.
Oh, wow. Seriously, I had no idea. Where are all these places skipping the time change?
Well, it makes sense when you consider geography, right? Like regions near the equator, they don't see much change in daylight hours throughout the year. So for them, shifting the clock wouldn't really make much of a difference. Even in the US, you've got variations. Hawaii doesn't do DST, and most of Arizona opts out too.
Huh, interesting. So they're just chilling with consistent time all year round. Makes you wonder if they're onto something. But, beyond just the hassle of changing clocks, I always feel that spring forward time change, physically. And it's not just losing an hour of sleep, it's like my whole health is off.
Right, yeah. You've hit on something really important there. Those health impacts of daylight saving time. They're often kind of overlooked, but they're huge. We're not just talking about feeling a little groggy for a day or two. It's more serious than that. Studies have actually shown, an increase in things like heart attacks and car accidents right after that springtime change.
Wow, that's scary. What's the science behind that? Why does that happen?
Basically, it boils down to messing with our body clocks, our circadian rhythms.
Yeah.
They control so much, our sleep-wake cycles, hormones, even digestion. When we suddenly jump that clock forward, it's like giving our bodies jet lag without even travel.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, and that disruption can lead to sleep deprivation, obviously, fatigue, more stress, and even problems thinking clearly. And all those effects could be even worse when the time change happens, right as people are going back to work or school.
Yeah, adding even more stress on top of it. It's like your body is trying to catch up and just can't. I bet a lot of our listeners can relate to that feeling.
For sure, most people have experienced it. Our bodies just aren't designed to handle those sudden shifts in time. It takes a while for our internal clock to reset,
So with that fallback coming up, does getting that extra hour back even things out? Does our body get a chance to recover from the spring change?
Unfortunately, not really. The problems caused by springing forward, they don't magically disappear when we get that hour back in the fall. It takes time for our bodies to adjust in both directions.
So twice a year, we're basically putting our bodies through this ringer. And that brings us to a pretty hot topic, this whole debate about making daylight saving time permanent. No more switching back and forth sounds pretty appealing, right?
Yeah, a lot of people think so.
But are there any downsides to that?
Well, yeah, there are some things to consider. We've actually tried permanent DST before in the US. Back in the 70s, it was like an experiment.
I've heard about that. What happened? Why'd they go back to changing the clocks?
Well, it ended up having some unintended consequences. Like, imagine kids going to school in the pitch black during winter. That was a big concern back then. And just generally, people were unhappy with those super dark mornings. So they ended up reversing the experiment because of all that.
So it's a real dilemma, isn't it? We could have those nice long summer evenings year-round, but then we risk those cold, dark winter mornings. Tough choice.
Definitely. And that's just one part of the DST debate. Another big piece is the economic impact. It's not just about individual people and their sleep schedules or health. DST actually affects businesses and the whole economy in measurable ways.
Oh, that's interesting. What kind of impact are we talking about? Are certain industries better off or worse off?
Absolutely. Like the retail industry, they often see a boost in sales during those extended daylight hours of DST. People tend to shop and eat out more in the evenings. But then you have other industries where it's not so great. Some studies show that worker productivity can actually go down. And there's even a higher risk of accidents at work in those first few days after the springtime change. So that can cost businesses money and affect worker safety too.
So some win, some lose. It adds a whole other layer to the whole thing. But with DST affecting us in so many ways, is there even a clear consensus on what to do about it?
Honestly, not really. It's a pretty complex issue. There are good points on all sides. You've got folks who are all about permanent standard time. They say it's better for our natural body clocks and sleep. Then there's the group pushing for permanent DST. They talk about stuff like more leisure time, less crime because it's brighter later, and even economic benefits for some businesses. And then you got the people who are just fine with things as they are. Those 2 times a year clock changes, yeah, they're annoying, but people figure, hey, we can manage.
It's like a tug of war, huh? Everyone pulling in different directions with their own priorities. But one thing's for sure, daylight saving time, it gets people talking, that's for sure, and it affects all of us in different ways.
Exactly, and it's important to think about all these different views, right? When we talk about keeping DST or getting rid of it, there's a lot to weigh. Potential good stuff against the bad stuff, and that can change depending on where you live, your health, the economy, even cultural values, all sorts of things.
Wow, it's crazy how something as simple as changing our clocks can lead to these big debates and get everyone fired up. Makes you think about time itself, Like, what is time, really?
That is pretty fascinating when you think about it. Time, it's tied to everything, our lives, our biology, our culture. We take it for granted, but how we measure time, how we structure it, it has a huge impact on our health, how we behave, even society as a whole. The whole DST thing, it really shows how deeply connected we are to time.
It makes you wonder, will we ever figure out the best way to handle time, especially now with technology and everyone being so connected, like time zones matter less, traditional work schedules are changing, it's a whole different ball game.
That's a great question. Maybe in the future, we'll be way more flexible with time. People in communities could decide what works for them, but still somehow coordinate things globally. Yeah.
That's a really interesting idea. Seems like a natural progression, right? With the world changing so fast and everyone connected. After going through all this, I'm seeing daylight saving time in a whole new way. It's not just losing or gaining an hour of sleep. It's about how time, energy, health, the economy, even culture, how they all kind of interact in this complicated way.
Absolutely. That's the beauty of learning and digging into stuff, isn't it? We can challenge what we think we know, see things from different angles, and have more thoughtful, informed discussions about, everything.
I'm really glad we did this deep dive into DST. It's been eye-opening for sure. So, as we wrap up, what's the one big thing you want listeners to take away from all this?
Well, I'd say time is a precious resource. It's powerful. And how we manage it has a big impact on everything. Whether you're for DST, against it, or somewhere in between, let's all try to understand the complexities and make choices that are good for our health, our productivity, our overall well-being.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. But before we go, I've got one last question for our listeners to think about. If you could choose, would you rather have permanent standard time or permanent daylight saving time? And why?
That's a great question, really worth thinking about. I encourage everyone to weigh the pros and cons, look at the research, and figure out what fits your own values and how you live your life.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Come join the conversation on our social media, share your opinions about DST. We're always up for a good discussion with our listeners. But for now, it's time to say goodbye. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into daylight saving time. It's been a fascinating journey, and we hope you've learned something new about this often overlooked part of our lives.
It's been a pleasure exploring this with you and our listeners. Time is fundamental to being human. Right. And understanding it is key to making good choices about how we live, work, and interact with the world.
Now, as we wrap this up, there's one more thought-provoking question that popped into my head that wasn't directly in the stuff we read. It came to me while we were talking about maybe having permanent DST. What do you think would happen to all those sunrise and sunset times that we connect with certain events or holidays?
Ooh, that's a good one. You're right, we didn't talk about that specifically. It would definitely change how we see time and those special moments tied to certain times of day. Imagine 4th of July fireworks at like 10 p.m. because the sun sets so late. Or think about Christmas morning. What if it didn't get light out until 9 a.m. instead of that early sunrise we're used to?
Yeah, it's almost like our cultural expectations wouldn't match up with what's actually happening with time anymore. It would be interesting to see if people would adapt, maybe even come up with new traditions.
For sure, it would be a big cultural shift. Shows just how deeply connected we are to time. It's not just science, it's woven into everything. Our lives, our stories, our shared experiences.
I think that's a perfect final thought for everyone. Something to ponder as you change your clocks this weekend. Maybe you'll start to see time in a whole new light.
Thanks again for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going.
And don't forget, whether you're springing forward or falling back, make the most of your time. We'll catch you on our next deep dive.
Yeah, it really is fascinating when you think about it, how much our perception of time ties in with our traditions and even like personal memories and stuff.
It is. It really highlights how messing with something as basic as clock time can have all these unexpected consequences that go way beyond just, convenience.
Makes you realize that daylight saving time, with all its craziness and arguments, it's just one example of how we humans are always trying to figure out this whole time thing, and how to bend it to our will. Exactly. Whether it's ancient civilizations looking at the stars to make calendars, or us today arguing about daylight saving time, it seems like we've always been obsessed with time and trying to control it.
Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into daylight saving time, huh?
It does.
It's been quite a journey, looking back through history, science, economics, even our own personal experiences.
It really has. Hopefully our listeners have a better understanding now of how time affects our lives in all these different ways.
I think so. So as we all go and change our clocks this weekend, let's take a minute to think about what it really means beyond just that 1 hour. And remember, whether you're springing forward or falling back, make the most of your time. We'll catch you on our next deep dive.